The dust of the high plains settled on everything, a fine gray powder that muted the world, and Silas understood it better than he understood most men, because the dust, at least, was honest about what it was doing. It was a slow burial. He stood at the wide window of his workshop, the one that faced the single unpaved street of the town called Providence, though he had yet to see much of that, and he watched the wind shepherd the grit against the false fronts of the general store and the saloon. His hands, stained the deep permanent brown of oak tannin and scarred with the fine white lines of 1,000 errant cuts from an awl or a skiving knife, rested on the sill, motionless. He had learned stillness the way other men learned scripture, a patient and solitary study that served him far better in this life, for stillness allowed a man to see things as they were, not as he wished them to be. He saw the heat shimmer rising from the baked earth and the way the horses at the hitching post dropped their heads against the afternoon sun, their tails flicking in a rhythm of weary surrender. He saw the banker, Mr. Hemlock, walk from his office to the store, his steps precise and measured as if counting the cost of the very ground he walked upon, and he saw the children of the blacksmith playing a game with stones in the sliver of shade by the water trough. It was a world of small, repeated movements, a clockwork of necessity and habit, and he was a part of it, the man who worked leather, who could take a torn and useless thing and, with patience and thread and wax, make it whole and strong again. His life was the smell of hide and oil, the heft of a finished saddle, the quiet satisfaction of a seam that would hold against all strain. It was enough. It had to be. He had come to this place not for its promise, but for its emptiness, for the vast and unforgiving sky that stretched from one horizon to the other without the interruption of ambition or memory. Here, a man's past could be ground down by the wind until it was just another particle of dust, indistinguishable from the rest. He kept to himself, his conversations limited to the particulars of a commission, the length of a stirrup, the tooling on a belt, the price of a new bridle. The townsfolk treated him with a kind of reserved respect, born of his skill and his silence. He was the leather man. He was reliable. He was there. They did not need to know more, and he was grateful for their lack of curiosity, because the things that had shaped him were not fit for casual conversation over a mercantile counter. They were heavy things, best left buried under the accumulated layers of quiet, methodical days. Each stitch he drove through the thick hide was an act of forgetting, a small, disciplined motion that kept the ghosts at bay. He worked from sunup until the light failed, and then he would sit in the near dark of his small room behind the shop, eating a spare meal of bread and dried meat, the silence broken only by the creak of the building settling and the distant lonely call of a coyote. He was not lonely. Loneliness was a feeling that belonged to a man who expected company, and he had long since given up that expectation. He had solitude. It was a different thing entirely, a solid and dependable state, like a well-made tool. It fit his hand. Afternoon. The stagecoach arrived, as it did every Tuesday, a cloud of its own making that resolved itself into a tired wooden box and 4 lathered horses. It was the town's main point of contact with the world beyond the horizon, bringing mail and goods and, occasionally, new faces. Silas watched from his window, a habit he kept not out of interest, but as a way to mark the passage of time. The driver, a man named Fitz, swung down and stretched his back, his face a mask of trail dust. A few passengers disembarked, blinking in the harsh light, their town clothes already looking defeated by the elements. Then a man stepped out, tall and wearing a black coat despite the heat, his movements clean and economical. He looked like a man who was accustomed to things going his way. Behind him, another figure emerged, hesitant, seeming to shrink from the light. It was a woman dressed in a traveling dress of such a pale and indeterminate gray that it seemed to be made of the dust itself. She kept her head down, her hands clutching a small, featureless reticule, and she stood a step behind the man, as if tethered to him by an invisible cord of duty or fear. They dressed her in gray so she'd vanish. The thought came to Silas unbidden, a clean, sharp observation like the cut of a fresh blade. She was meant to be overlooked, a shadow attached to the man in black, her presence an afterthought. But he saw her. Across the dusty expanse of the street, through the shimmering heat and the settling grit, he saw her. He saw the tension in her shoulders and the way her fingers worried the clasp of her bag, a small, frantic motion that betrayed the stillness of the rest of her body. He saw a flicker of something in the brief moment she lifted her head to glance at the town, a look not of curiosity but of appraisal, the rapid assessing glance of a creature gauging the dimensions of a new cage. Then her eyes met his. It was for less than a second, a collision of gazes across an impossible distance, and in that instant he felt a jolt, a recognition of something he hadn't known he was missing. It was the sight of another soul who understood the language of stillness, who knew that the most important things were often the things left unsaid, the things held tight and silent in the desperate hope of survival. Then the man in black, Cade, as he would come to be known, touched her elbow, his grip possessively firm, and steered her toward the boarding house. She did not look back. Silas turned from the window. The scent of leather and oil filled his lungs, a familiar and grounding smell. But something had shifted. A stone had been dropped into the still pool of his solitude, and the ripples were spreading. Days later, the town absorbed the newcomers as it absorbed everything else, with a slow, watchful indifference. The man, Cade, let it be known that the woman, Alara, was his late cousin's daughter, his ward, a delicate creature of fragile health and nervous disposition whom he had brought west for the clean, dry air. He said it with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a smile that dismissed her even as it claimed to protect her. The townspeople nodded and accepted it. It was a plausible story, and they had their own troubles to occupy them. Alara was seen only rarely, a gray flicker at Cade's side as he conducted his business, which seemed to consist mostly of talking to Mr. Hemlock at the bank and playing cards in the saloon. When she walked, her eyes were always on the ground a few feet in front of her, as if she were charting a careful course through a field of hidden dangers. She never spoke, at least not where anyone could hear. She was becoming what the gray dress intended her to be, invisible, a piece of baggage, a responsibility. But Silas saw her. He saw her when she stood for a moment by the mercantile window, her gaze fixed on a bolt of blue calico cloth, a flash of longing so profound on her face it was like a cry. He saw her when Cade's voice grew sharp in the street, and she flinched, a small, barely perceptible tightening of her entire body, a recoil so practiced it was second nature. He saw the paleness of her skin and the faint bruised-looking shadows beneath her eyes. He saw a survivor. He recognized the look. It was the look of a person who had learned to make themselves small, to take up as little space in the world as possible, to breathe shallowly so as not to draw notice. He knew that look because he had once worn it himself. Cade came into his shop one morning. The bell above the door gave a thin, cheerful jingle that was entirely at odds with the man who entered. He carried a saddle, not a working rancher's saddle, but a fancy tooled thing made for show. It was a good piece of leather, but one of the cinch straps had been torn nearly through. Cade dropped it on the workbench with a thud that was a statement of impatience. "Can you fix this?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Silas ran his thumb over the torn leather. The cut was clean, deliberate, not an accident. "I can," Silas said, his voice a low rasp from disuse. He did not look at Cade, keeping his attention on the damage. "It will take time. I'll have to unstitch the entire skirt to set a new strap properly." Cade waved a dismissive hand. "I need it by the end of the week. I have business in the capital." He looked around the shop, his eyes lingering on the neat rows of tools, the stacks of cured hides, the finished goods hanging from pegs on the wall. It was the look of a man appraising livestock. "You do good work, they say." Silas nodded, picking up a stitching awl, the wooden handle worn smooth and dark from the oils of his hand. He felt the familiar weight of it, the solid comfort of a tool that knew its purpose. "I do the work that's needed," he said. Cade leaned against the counter, a lazy confidence in his posture. "My ward, Alara," he said, the name dropped into the quiet shop like a stone. "She finds the town rustic. She's a delicate thing, not suited for this kind of life." Silas continued to examine the saddle, his focus absolute. He heard the unspoken message. He heard the assertion of ownership, the warning. "This is mine. Do not look. Do not think. Do not see." He began to carefully snip the old stitches, holding the saddle skirt in place, each tiny sound clear and sharp in the heavy silence. "The air's good for the constitution," Silas said, his words flat and non-committal. Cade laughed, a short, unpleasant bark. "Perhaps. Or perhaps some flowers are just meant for a greenhouse." He pushed himself off the counter. "End of the week," he repeated, and then he was gone, the bell jangling his departure. Silas stood motionless for a long time after the door closed, the awl still in his hand. He looked at the clean cut on the saddle strap. It was not a tear from a fall or a snag on a branch. It was a knife cut, a message. He knew with a certainty that settled cold and hard in his gut that Cade had cut it himself. It was a test, a display of casual power, the power to break a fine thing simply because he could, and the power to command another man to fix it. And it was a warning, aimed at the whole town, but at Silas in particular. "I can break anything I own." That afternoon, he saw her. She was sitting on the bench outside the boarding house, ostensibly for the air, but she sat as still as a statue, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Cade was in the saloon. Silas could hear the low murmur of voices and the clink of glasses from across the street. He watched her for a long time from the shadows of his workshop doorway. She was staring at nothing, or perhaps at everything, her gaze lost in the shimmering distance. She looked profoundly alone, an island of gray in a sea of brown dust. He went back inside, to his bench. He took a small, leftover piece of scrap leather, the soft kind he used for lining. With a fine, sharp blade, he began to cut. He didn't think about what he was doing, letting his hands work from a place deeper than thought. He worked for an hour, his movements precise and economical. When he was done, he held a small, perfectly rendered leather bluebird, no bigger than his thumb. The tooling was intricate, each feather defined, its head cocked as if listening for a song. It was a useless, beautiful thing. He walked across the street, his boots scuffing in the thick dust. He did not go directly to her. He went to the water trough and pretended to check the level, his back to her. Then, on his way back to his shop, he walked past her bench. As he passed, without looking at her, without breaking his stride, he let the small leather bird fall from his hand. It landed in the dust near her feet. He didn't look back to see if she picked it up. He couldn't. It was too great a risk for both of them. He just returned to his shop, the scent of tannin and oil suddenly feeling less like a comfort and more like a cage. He had done a foolish thing, a dangerous thing. He had acknowledged her existence. He had told her that she was seen. He did not see her for 2 days. Cade came and went, his stride confident, his cold smile fixed in place. The life of the town continued its slow, predictable rhythm. Silas worked on the saddle, his stitches small and even and strong, a testament to his craft. He tried to put the woman in gray out of his mind, to retreat back into the safe, walled garden of his solitude. But the image of her face, that brief moment of shared recognition across the street, was burned into his memory. He kept seeing the flash of longing in her eyes at the sight of the blue calico. He kept feeling the phantom weight of the small leather bird in his palm. He had crossed a line, and he did not know what the consequences would be. On the 3rd day, she came to the shop. The bell jingled, and he looked up from his work, his heart giving a hard, painful kick against his ribs. It was her. She stood just inside the doorway, clutching a small basket, her eyes on the floor. She was alone. "Mr. Cade sent me," she said, her voice so low and soft he had to strain to hear it. "To see if the saddle is ready." He knew it was a lie. The saddle wasn't due until tomorrow, and Cade was not a man to send a messenger for something he could just as easily check on himself. "It's nearly done," Silas said. He gestured with his head toward the saddle, which was sitting on its stand, gleaming with a fresh coat of oil, the new strap indistinguishable from the original work. She took a hesitant step into the shop, the air thick with the smells of his trade. Her eyes darted around, taking in the tools, the hides, the quiet order of the place. She was like a wild thing, poised for flight. He saw that her knuckles were white where she gripped the handle of the basket. He said nothing, simply went back to his work, polishing a silver concho on the saddle skirt, giving her the space to exist without the pressure of his gaze. He wanted her to know she was safe here. After a long moment of silence, she spoke again, her voice still a near whisper. "He does not like it when people notice things." Silas paused in his polishing, his hand still. He looked at her then, and she met his gaze. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, deep and troubled, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Defiance. "Some things are hard not to notice," he said. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she reached into her basket and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of cloth. She held it out to him. It was a handkerchief, immaculately clean, and in one corner, stitched with thread the color of a summer sky, was a tiny, perfect bluebird. Its wings were outstretched, as if in mid-flight. He looked from the stitching to her face. He saw the story in the impossibly fine stitches, a story of patience and hidden skill, a story of quiet rebellion. It was an answer. It was a thank you. It was a warning. "I see you too. Be careful." He reached out and took the handkerchief. His calloused, dye-stained fingers brushed against hers. Her skin was cool. The touch lasted only a second, but it was like a brand. "Tell Mr. Cade it will be ready tomorrow," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. As promised, she nodded again, turned, and slipped out of the shop as quietly as she had entered, leaving him standing in the middle of the floor, holding a piece of linen with a bird stitched on it, the world tilting on its axis. He knew then that his solitude was broken, perhaps forever. And he knew, with a grim and terrible certainty, that a storm was coming to Providence. That night. The saloon was louder than usual, the spill of yellow light and rough laughter staining the dusty street. Cade was holding court, his voice rising above the others, expansive and self-satisfied. Silas stood in the deep shadow of his own workshop, watching. He had seen Alara earlier, a brief glimpse of her face in the upstairs window of the boarding house, a pale oval in the darkness. She had been watching the street, watching the saloon, waiting. He didn't know what she was waiting for, but the sight of her had filled him with a cold dread. He was a man who understood violence, not the loud, brawling violence of the saloon, but the quiet, deliberate violence of a predator. He recognized it in Cade, in the man's easy confidence, in the cold calculation in his eyes. Cade was a man who enjoyed breaking things, and he was growing bored with this town. He would soon need a new amusement. An hour passed, then another. The moon rose, a sliver of bone in the black sky. Finally, the doors of the saloon swung open, and two men stumbled out, supporting each other, their laughter coarse. They were followed by Cade and another man, a rancher named Barlow, whose property bordered the edge of nowhere. Barlow was a hard man, known for his temper and his wealth. Cade clapped him on the back, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "It's a settled thing, then," Cade said, his tone slick with satisfaction. "A good match. It will settle her nerves, give her a purpose." Barlow grunted, a sound of crude approval. "She's a quiet one. I like that. I'll send my wagon for her things at the end of the week." They shook hands, sealing a bargain made over whiskey and cards. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He understood now. Cade wasn't her guardian. He was her broker. He was selling her. The thought was so ugly it made him physically sick. He looked up at the window of the boarding house. The pale oval of her face was gone. He felt a profound and suffocating sense of helplessness. What could he do? He was a leather worker, a man of solitude and silence. Cade was a man of influence and casual menace, backed by the implicit approval of men like Barlow and the willful ignorance of the town. To interfere would be to invite a kind of trouble he had spent years trying to outrun. He could do nothing. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. He turned to go back into the darkness of his shop, to the familiar comfort of his tools and the silence that had always been his shield. But he stopped. He thought of the leather bird, a useless, beautiful thing. He thought of the impossibly small stitches on the handkerchief, a secret language of defiance. He thought of her eyes, the color of a storm, and the flicker of a soul that refused to be extinguished, a soul that refused to be made invisible. Not here, not today, not to him. He would not let the dust bury this one living thing. He turned back toward the light of the saloon, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He did not know what he was going to do, but he knew he was going to do something. The stillness was over. He waited until the next day. He needed to think, to let the hot rage cool into something cold and hard and useful. He was not a fool. A direct confrontation with a man like Cade would be unpredictable and likely violent, a contest he might not win. And even if he did, what then? He could not simply take her. The law, such as it was in a place like this, would be on Cade's side. He was her legal guardian, a fact he had no doubt established with Mr. Hemlock at the bank. No, this had to be a different kind of fight, one fought on Cade's own terms, the terms of a transaction. He spent the morning gathering his assets. It did not take long. There was the money he had saved, a small but respectable sum hidden in a loose floorboard beneath his bed. There were his tools, each one chosen and cared for over years, an extension of his own hands. And there was the shop itself, the building, and the small piece of land it stood on, his one claim to this world, the physical manifestation of the quiet life he had built. He took the deed from the lockbox where he kept it. The paper was crisp, the ink faded but clear. It represented everything he had. It was his anchor, his fortress. He folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. He spent the rest of the day at his bench, not working, but simply sitting, feeling the familiar textures of his world, the rough grain of the workbench, the smooth handle of a burnishing tool, the cool weight of a spool of waxed thread. He was saying goodbye to it, or at least to the life it represented. He was stepping out of the circle of safety he had drawn around himself, and he knew he might never be able to step back in. Evening. The saloon was filling up again. Cade was there, at his usual table, a whiskey in his hand, accepting the congratulations of a few of the other patrons on the arrangement he had made for his ward. Barlow was not there, which was for the best. This needed to be between him and Cade. Silas walked across the street, each step deliberate, final. The dust puffed up around his boots. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The room fell quiet, not silent, but the hum of conversation dropped to a low murmur. Heads turned. His presence here was an event. He was not a saloon man. He walked directly to Cade's table. Cade looked up, a slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. Silas, to what do we owe the honor? Come to celebrate my good fortune? Some of the men at the nearby tables snickered. Silas ignored them. He ignored the chair. He stood before the table, a still, dark figure in the smoky room. I came to make you an offer, he said, his voice level. Cade's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He leaned back in his chair, feigning amusement. An offer? For what? A new saddle? I'm afraid my business here is concluded. For her, Silas said. The room went completely silent now. The only sound was the hiss of the lanterns. Cade's eyes went cold. They were flat and gray, like river stones. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Silas said. I'm talking about Alara. I'm told there's an arrangement. I'd like to make a counter-arrangement. Cade's knuckles were white where he gripped his glass. He was a man accustomed to control, and he was losing it here, in public. She is my ward, my family. Her future is not a matter for public auction. The hypocrisy of the statement was so profound, it was almost admirable. Everything has a price, Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. You, of all people, should know that. He reached into his coat and took out the folded deed. He placed it on the table between them. He added the pouch of money beside it. It was everything he had in the world. Cade stared at the papers, then back up at Silas, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. You're insane, he hissed. You think you can buy her with this? He gestured contemptuously at the offering. It's not a purchase, Silas said. It's a trade. This, he tapped the deed, for her guardianship. Sign it over to me. Then you can leave this rustic town and its delicate air behind you. A low murmur went through the room. The onlookers were no longer amused. They were watching a different kind of contest now, one of raw will. They were seeing a quiet man reveal a spine of iron. Cade was trapped. To refuse was to admit that his guardianship was not, in fact, a matter of commerce, which his very public deal with Barlow proved false. To accept was to suffer the humiliation of being bought out by a simple leather worker. He was a man who cared about appearances, about power. He looked around the room, at the watching faces. He saw no support there, only a cold, waiting curiosity. His smile was gone now, replaced by a tight, bloodless line. He was a snake, cornered. He might strike. Silas stood his ground, his body relaxed, his gaze unwavering. He was ready. He had been ready for this his whole life. It was then that the saloon doors creaked open. Alara stood there. She was not dressed in gray. She wore a simple dark blue dress the color of twilight. It was a dress he had never seen before, one she must have kept hidden. Her hair was neatly combed and her head was held high. She walked into the room, her steps steady, and came to stand not behind Silas but beside him. She looked directly at Cade, her eyes clear and unafraid. She did not say a word. She did not have to. Her presence was her statement. I'm not a piece of property. I'm not a contract to be traded. I'm here. It was the final move in a game Cade did not even know he was playing. Her quiet act of courage, of self-possession, tipped the scales. Cade looked from her to Silas, and then to the deed on the table. He saw the truth. He had lost. His power had always been predicated on her fear, on her invisibility. Now, standing here in her blue dress, she was no longer invisible, and she was not afraid. He made a sound, a choked noise of pure frustration. He snatched the deed and the money from the table. Fine, he spat, the word dripping with venom. She's your problem now. The both of you deserve each other. He shoved his chair back, the legs scraping harshly on the wooden floor, and stormed out of the saloon without a backward glance. The silence he left behind was heavy, profound. Silas did not watch him go. He was looking at Alara. She turned her head and met his gaze. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had ever seen her smile. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. He felt the tension drain out of him, leaving him feeling hollowed out and strangely light. He had lost everything he owned. He had no shop, no home, no money. All he had was the handkerchief with the stitched bluebird in his pocket and the woman standing beside him. It was more than enough. Weeks later. The sun was setting, painting the vast sky in strokes of orange and purple. Silas worked at a makeshift bench set up in the livery stable, the owner having offered him the space in exchange for keeping the harnesses and saddles in good repair. It was a smaller space, smelling of hay and horses instead of tannin and oil, but it was honest work. He was mending a bridle, his hands moving with the same steady, practiced grace. The work was the same. The world was different. Alara sat on a stool nearby, mending one of his shirts. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric with a quiet, hypnotic rhythm. She was wearing a dress the color of the blue calico from the mercantile window. He had bought it for her with the first money he had earned from his repair work. She was no longer a gray shadow. She was a point of color and life in the dusty twilight. They did not talk much, not with words. They had discovered they did not need to. They spoke a language of shared presence, of quiet understanding. He would watch the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched, and she would watch the way his hands moved over the leather, sure and knowing. They shared their spare meals in the evenings, sitting on crates in the stable doorway, watching the stars come out. He was learning the story of her life in small pieces, not from what she said, but from what she did. He learned of her patience from the precision of her needlework, of her resilience from the way she was slowly, carefully unfurling, like a plant that had been denied the sun for too long. He learned of her kindness from the way she would leave a cup of water on his bench when the afternoon grew hot, without a word. She, in turn, was learning him. She saw the gentleness in his scarred hands, the deep well of stillness in him that was not emptiness but strength. She saw the man who had been willing to trade his entire world for a person he barely knew, not as a grand gesture, but as a simple, necessary act, like setting a bone or stitching a wound. One evening, as they sat watching the last of the light fade from the sky, she spoke. "The bluebird," she said, her voice soft in the growing dark. "My mother taught me how to stitch them. She said they were a reminder that even the smallest thing can cross the widest sky." Silas looked at her. He thought of the tiny leather bird he had carved, a foolish, hopeful gesture. He thought of the two of them, two solitary people who had found each other in a world that had tried to erase them. "She was right," he said. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on her knee. His fingers were rough against her skin. Her hand was steady and warm beneath his. They sat like that for a long time in the quiet as the stars began to burn in the immense dark expanse above them. The dust of the high plains still settled on everything, but it no longer felt like a burial. It felt like a blanket, settling over a world that was, against all odds, beginning anew. We tell ourselves stories about heroes, about loud men with fast guns who ride in to save the day. But maybe the truest courage isn't in the grand, noisy gestures. Maybe it's quieter. Maybe it's in the small, defiant act of stitching a bluebird onto a handkerchief when the world has dressed you in gray. Maybe it's in the decision to see someone, to truly see them, when everyone else has agreed to look away. We all have a choice, every day, in the face of casual cruelty or calculated indifference. We can choose to be a part of the silence, to let the dust settle. Or we can choose to offer up everything we have, not for a reward, not for glory, but for the simple, profound truth that another person's dignity is worth as much as our own. The question, then, isn't whether heroes exist. It's which kind of hero you will choose to be. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, we'd be grateful if you'd leave a like or a comment sharing a time you saw an act of quiet courage. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please consider subscribing. It helps us to keep telling them. Until next time, be well and look for the color in a world of gray.